Shalom. I thought I had been to the largest Jewish temple in the world, the shul in Budapest, where Theodor Herzl once used to attend, but I'm told that, and I now believe it, that this one outranks it. The last one I went to, because usually I don't go into houses of worship unless I'm wearing about a ton of garlic around my neck, was the very tiny temple on the Tunisian island of Jerba, the foundation stone of which is said to have come from the original temple itself, a wonderful gem, little gem of a synagogue, blown up in 2003 by Al-Qaeda, but recently repaired, along with its tenacious community. So comparing and contrasting that miniature and that grandiosity, I'm very glad to find myself this evening speaking in what appears to my disordered senses to be the dining room of Hogwarts School. Though I dare say I couldn't have picked a less apt name for a Jewish house of worship. I also have a question, just before we start. I'd like everyone to put up their hands. Who knows why the World Series is called the World Series? One. And she could be wrong. Feverishly, for years, I asked, when I arrived here as an immigrant from England, why do they call it the World Series? No one else in the world plays this game except Canada, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and I think Japan. How dare they call it the World Series? No one can tell me why it's called the World Series. And no one here can either. This thing, why not? It's our game. Naturally, it's the World Series. And we're the world champions at it. The New York World, ladies and gentlemen, used to sponsor this series, a now defunct newspaper. That's why it's called the World Series. It could have been called the Post Series. It could have been called the Newsday Series. Just a warning against hubris before we start, and against man-made reification and myth of the sort that can turn into something rather dangerous, morally and intellectually, which brings me to my theme. When I was looking for a subtitle for my book, God Is Not Great, I thought, let's not be sensational, let's not be catch-penny, let's not be cheap, but let's try and get people's attention. I thought God Is Not Great might do that already. I called it How Religion and Why Religion Poisons Everything. I knew what would happen. People would say, what, everything? What, you mean chess? You mean tantric sex? You mean tourism? It poisons everything? Well, in a way, as I've gone on with this debate, and as I persist in it tonight, and as I will tomorrow, I would be more and more willing, ever more willing to defend myself in saying that it's a universal toxin from which nothing is exempt. First, I believe and I maintain that it attacks us in our very deepest integrity, in the core of our self-respect. Religion says that we would not know right from wrong. We would not know an evil, wicked act from a decent human act without divine permission or without divine authority, or without, even worse, either the fear of divine punishment or the hope of a divine reward. It strips us of the right to make our own determination, as all humans always have, about what is and what is not a right and good action. To give a trivial example that I hope none of you will find really actually trivial. As you know from the archaeological work of Israel Finkelstein and others, the story of the wandering in exile described in Exodus is a mythical one. It's an entirely invented one, a metaphorical one at best, but it does tell a very important story. And it does say that after a very long wandering, my mother's ancestors got to the foot of Mount Sinai and were informed that perjury, theft, and murder were non-kosher. Now, my question to you is this. How far would the Jewish people have got? Would they have got that far, even wandering around in the desert, leaderless in sometimes ways, if they'd been under the impression that murder and theft and perjury were okay. I think it's an insult to have it said that that was the case. I think, in other words, that all one needs to know about is human solidarity and the need for it, and human evolution from the savannah and from the places in Africa where we very nearly died out and were very nearly exterminated before the escape, that we wouldn't have made it this far if we didn't have this knowledge in us as innate. There is no need for divine permission. And those who say that there is are willing to prostrate themselves before an altar. And they may say, well, at least it's a Jewish altar. Well, then how will they deny the Wahhabi Muslim the right to say the same thing? To prostrate himself in front of God. The Salafi Muslim, to prostrate himself in front of God and say, only from you can I receive anything. Only from you can I receive an idea. Only from you can I receive a principle. Will we say, well, that's fine. Louis Farrakhan's racist crackpot cult organization can get black people off drugs in prison, they say. So they get the same privilege. It all comes from on high. That's the first point. The second point is, in a sense, imbricated in and necessitated by what I've just said. In the vale of tears in which we live, of insecurity, anxiety, doubt, combat and struggle, all these things, by the way, I think are good for us and help us to grow up. We shouldn't wish for a world where there was eternal peace and tranquility and banality. We should welcome the chance to take part in struggle and to be afflicted by anxiety. But in this world, there are problems that the human race has always faced and always will, and that philosophers have wrestled with and always will have to, and that aestheticians and artists have tortured themselves about. There's only one solution to this that doesn't work, and that is to refer it upward and to say, if only there was a celestial dictator who could just take this responsibility from us and legislate the whole thing for us and accept our blind, obedient, self-abnegating trust, then maybe everything would be all right. I hope it shouldn't be necessary to say, in a place of this kind, in a refuge of this kind, that there is no totalitarian solution to our problems. That very fortunately, I think, we are on our own, and we have only our own responsibility and our own mentation and intellect and principle with which to face these things. It can't be said that a God whose authority is unchallengeable, who can convict you of thought crime while you sleep, who can tell you that you're condemned for something you thought you might do, who knows your thoughts, who has utter unchallengeable authority over you, whose rule makes that of Kim Il-sung make the idea of a celestial North Korea seem laughable, that such an authority can be the answer to our problems. No. It's perhaps, you might think, sad, but I think good, that we don't have that resource. We cannot prostrate ourselves before a dictator, an absolutist, and we can't hope to refer these things upward. Well, those are my two main points, and I don't know how far I've got, but I must be trespassing on the rabbi's time. But I think I ought to add that if this belief was moral, because there are those who say, well, it may not be true, there may not actually be a God, the holy books may not tell a true story, they may be metaphorical, all the evidence is that all holy books are man-made, as all religion is, and not God-made. Nonetheless, still, we have our morality from them, and at least religion coerces people into behaving better. They don't, as an English duchess once said, they don't fornicate in the street and frighten the horses. That's all she asked of the lower orders. I think, again, we're being asked to insult ourselves and to disrespect ourselves and to think of ourselves as servile, as slave-like, as abject and lacking in self-respect. We don't need permission to act morally. Religion takes morality from us. Human solidarity is the basis of morality. We would not have come this far. We couldn't have lived this long. We couldn't have evolved this much if we didn't know that we had to look out for one another, and that well before Rabbi Hillel enunciates the golden rule, that the same instruction is found in the Analects of Confucius. Do not do to others what would be repulsive if done to you by another. These are insights that we possess innately as of right. And the last time that right was called divine, and that the idea that rights could only be derived from the divine, it was the divine right of kings, which replaced the idea of a celestial, unalterable dictatorship in heaven, and said that it was the permission for totalitarian rule also by other human beings here on earth. And if you ask yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, brothers, sisters, comrades, friends, what is the greatest threat? Not just to our moral but our physical survival. And what is the greatest insult to our intellectual integrity at present? I think at least a number of you would be inclined to agree with me that that threat is probably theocratic. That humans who claim divine authority, that humans who claim to tell us what to do, that humans who say they'll kill themselves, they're so keen to kill us, who have a cult of suicide, a death wish, and believe they have divine permission for it, are by far the most menacing of our foes. And that they don't just threaten us physically, they threaten all the gains of civilization, all the gains of thought and reflection and art and aesthetics. So that those who claim that they have a hotline to the Almighty or to God have a lot of disproving to do before they can show that they are not part, that they don't take a share in the worst and most impermeable tyranny that one could well face. I'm incredibly grateful to you for inviting me, and very grateful to you for listening this far. Thank you.
Okay, should I just go? No, that won't do at all. First of all, before I say why that won't do, let me just tell you what a joy it is for a rabbi to speak to a different congregation than his own, because you haven't heard all my bits and stories and jokes. And many years ago, Harold Kushner, when he retired, told me that he used to think that the secret to the rabbinate was changing your sermons, but now he knows that it's just changing your audience. I want to address both points because both of them, I believe, are made right in the face of everything that we learn in our tradition. And by our tradition, I mean Judaism particularly, but not only Judaism. That is, in the tradition of the monotheistic faiths. And let me start with this idea that we didn't know murder, theft, perjury were bad until we found ourselves at the foot of Mount Sinai. In fact, I think that if you read the beginning of the Bible, which I strongly advise, you will find that Cain is condemned for killing Abel. Now, why is he condemned if the Bible assumes that you don't learn that murder is bad until you get to Sinai? After all, Cain is long before Sinai. Of course the Bible knows that human beings recognize that murder is bad. But the Bible also knows that they do it anyway. And that without a divine sanction against murder, people will think that it is a humanly invented sanction. And if they will violate it even when it's God's dictate, how much more will it prove to be, and I will come back to this, a fragile rule when it's the rule of human beings. And so at Sinai, what you get is not a series of moral rules that you never could have imagined for yourself. Oh, I thought it was fine to kill before I got here. But the knowledge that it is built into the moral structure of the universe. It's not a personal preference. It's not a societal rule. It is a mandate from God to all human beings. And if you think that mandate doesn't matter, all I can say is you haven't paid much attention to the 20th century. You know, in Karamazov, Ivan Karamazov in Dostoevsky's novel says famously, without God, everything is possible. Except that Dostoevsky feared that eventuality. The same conclusion was drawn by Nietzsche in Germany, but Nietzsche celebrated that eventuality as he had his madman run through the streets and say that we have killed God. Both of these prophets knew that we were coming to a time when a consciousness of God would not filter through Western society. And they recognized that things would be different. And in fact, Dostoevsky in Russia, leading to communism, Nietzsche in Germany, leading to Nazism, were exactly right. It's not that religious people always behave well. It's that the voice of Sinai makes a difference to individuals and to societies, and to suggest that it was a voice that taught us as opposed to reinforced is to make a mistake. And to assume that all you need, I am quoting now, all one needs to know is human solidarity seems to me to fly in the face of everything we know about human beings. If you think that people are basically good, then I suggest you visit a playground. What happens when a new child comes onto the playground? Do the other children go, "Oh, look, a new child. Let us embrace him and share our toys"? Of course not. They say, "Get the new kid." Because there is an innate distrust of the other. And that has to be transcended by some principle that is greater than the group, such as there is one God, and that one God is sovereign over all, and that everybody is a sister and a brother. I mean, look, parents know this. If people weren't of mixed light and darkness, then it would be very easy to raise kids. You'd say, don't share so much. Don't be so good. Don't always behave. But civilizing a human being takes a lot of work. Rogers and Hammerstein got it exactly wrong when they said that hate has to be carefully taught. It's goodness and love that have to be carefully taught. And that's the purpose of the Torah. It's not to tell you things that you don't know. It's to reinforce and give authority and depth and complexity and richness to what you do know, but you don't always do. That's the first point. And then the second point is what God is in the monotheistic traditions. God is not the tyrant of North Korea. First of all, by the way, just as an aside, as I mentioned in the book, it's very interesting that you've got North Korea and South Korea. North Korea is an atheistic tyranny that Mr. Hitchens uses to compare to God. South Korea is a flourishing democracy and has a very strong Christian culture. So which one do you want to live in? You want to live in religious South Korea or atheistic North Korea? But that's just an aside. Here's back to the main point. If you think of God on a human analogy, the proper analogy is not a tyrant. It's not Big Brother. Mr. Hitchens wrote a very estimable book on George Orwell, and maybe that persuaded him to think of God in the way that we think of Big Brother. But in fact, think of it differently. Because he says not only does God know what you do, God even knows your thoughts. What could be more frightening than that? Child psychologists tell us that before a child reaches the age of I, that is the ability to say I, they don't know what is internal and what is external. Child cries, the breast appears. They don't realize that an outside agency is responding to them. Their mother, so to speak, is inside them. Does that cause fear, or is that intimacy and love? Somebody who deeply believes in God does not feel that God's knowing them is tyrannical, is overbearing, is frightening, but rather is embracing and is beautiful. That's what it means to believe in the God of the traditions at their best. Are there contrary teachings? Absolutely. Religion is not univocal. It's been around for thousands of years, and lots of people have said many things, some of them foolish, Just ask Mr. Hitchens. He will give you a fairly startling catalog. But this is, in fact, the idea that human beings are all one, that there is a moral order to the universe, and that we are loved. And that's not a tyranny. That's the sovereignty of God. And that's why I want to close up by telling you that really this debate is based on a misperception. It has to do with what the religious person is. The religious person is not someone who totes up some arguments from column A and some arguments from column B. I taught for many years, and both in New York and in Los Angeles, theology, and I used to teach all the proofs, and I put that in quotation marks for God, the ontological proof, the teleological proof, the cosmological proof. I diagrammed them on the board, I explained them. I never had a student come up to me after class and go, "Now I believe." Because it is not an intellectual process by which we come to an understanding of God. Rather, it is something deeper. It's an orientation of the soul towards the universe. It's how you see the world. It's how you apprehend its beauty and its richness and its wonder and its love. And if you see it in a detached way, in a disenchanted way, and you say, what I need is proof the same way that I need proof in a test tube or a laboratory,
Remind me. What have we got now?
then you will not, in fact, discover what it is that the great traditions of the world mean when they say, Karov Adonai l'kol korav, l'kol asher yikra'uhu ve'emet. God is close to those who call upon God, to those who call upon God in truth. Thank you.
Well done. I overran my time last time, so I'll try and condense and get nearer to our exchange this time. But
it's good to know you have a sense of Jewish time.
Right, Jewish time will do. Thomas Jefferson, whose biographer I am in a small way, once said, meditating on slavery in his notes on the state of Virginia, he said, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. Once you've heard that statement, I'm sure many of you have heard or read it before. Once you have, as you'll know, you won't forget it again. You'll always remember that he said that. But when you think about it again, or even at all, you realize it's a nonsensical statement, almost an idiotic one. If there was a just God, what would there be to tremble about? If we were in the hands of a benign deity, a father who always looked out for us and wished for the best, where would be the rest of Jewish history? Where would be the rest of human history? There'd be nothing really to worry about. It would be like scraping your knee in the famous playground. How bad could it be? There's a just God. Now, I don't think anyone here who's studied human society and human history and the human tragedy, whether you define tragedy as the Greeks did, as the fatal flaw in our own design, or whether you define it as Hegel did, as the terrible moment when there's a conflict between two concepts of right, you can't just say, well, thank heavens, at least Daddy is still on duty. And I'm afraid to say the only people who do say that are childish. It is a childish thing to say and a childish thing to believe. And the whole concept that we are God's children and that we have an eternal Father is itself quite obviously man-made. Did man make God in his own image or God make man in his own image? Ask yourselves and see what your reason and what the evidence of your study of history and society will tell you for that. Now, I'm relatively impartial as between different monotheisms. I think Bertrand Russell is essentially right that they all make the same mistake. However, since you mentioned the tradition, Rabbi, let's agree that Judaism has a couple of claims it can make. It doesn't proselytize, and also anyone can join. That's not bad compared to some religions. it doesn't make the idiotic mistake of saying the Messiah has already come, so what's there to worry about? The greatest remark made, I think, is by the Rambam saying, okay, the Messiah will come, but he may tarry. In that sort of shrug, you have everything from Lenny Bruce to Woody Allen to Marx and Freud and Einstein. But to remind you of this is also to remind you that the great tradition, the really great tradition, is diaspora secularism, is not the belief that if you go on talking to a bit of wall in far-off Jerusalem, that you will be heard. That's a nonsensical belief and has led to terrible error. Now, on the Karamazov point, or rather, I think the character in the book is actually Smerdyakov, who says, without God, all things are possible. Let's examine. Let's examine what you said about divine condemnation of murder. I say that the condemnation of murder is human, that humans know, without being told, whether it's Cain or whether it's any other example, without being told that this is a crime, an illness. You say, well, irrelevantly, I think, you say, well, Cain is understood to have been a murderer. Well, so would any human have known that he was, though there were only apparently about 2 other humans around at the time, if you believe the story. But here's the point. What about the divine mandates for murder? What about the times when God tells you, you must be a murderer? When God says you must destroy every member of the Amalekite tribe down to the last child, saving only a few virgins of theirs for purposes probably somewhat better imagined than described. What about that? What about the Quranic injunction to treat the Jews as if they were treacherous and murderous and deceitful? Wasn't that dictated by God also in the desert? What about His Holiness the Pope saying until 1965, ladies and gentlemen, that every Jewish person was collectively guilty of deicide? Wasn't that said by the vicar of Christ on earth, the man who held the keys of Peter, who had divine authority? By what right, Rabbi, do you say that you know God better than they do? That your God is better than theirs? That you have an access that I can't claim to have, to knowing not just that there is a God, but to knowing His mind? You put it modestly, but it is a fantastically arrogant claim that you make, an incredibly immodest claim, and if made by a fanatic, or by a bully, or by a murderer, I'll take it to the next stage and reply directly to Karamazov and Smerdyakov. Isn't it rather the case that with God, anything is permissible? Once someone has said, God told me to do it, what is not allowed? Is it not the case that the genital mutilation community, the child genital mutilation community, is exclusively religious? They only do it because God wants it done. The suicide murder community, pretty much exclusively theocratic. They only do it because God tells them to do it. The slavery community, there's no place in the world where slavery has ever been practiced when it hasn't been justified by reference to the holy books. Entirely religious. Isn't it the case that once people think they have divine permission, there's no crime, no wickedness, no cruelty, no misery that they won't inflict on their fellow creatures? If you accept the first injunction, it seems to me you are absolutely obliged to consider the second. And if we are made indeed in the image of God, if that is the case, then how do we explain the psychopath, the torturer, the Nazi, the sociopath, the sadist? Are these not also cast from the same coin and falling from the same press? I'll just have to close by denying what you say about North Korea, where I've been. I've been to all the axis of evil countries in my day. North Korea is the most religious state in the world, by far. I used to wonder when I was a kid, what is it like to praise God all day and thank Him all the time, forever, always thanking, always praising, always groveling, always abject? What would that be like? They say that's what heaven is like. It sounds like hell to me, but I still couldn't picture it. Now I've been to North Korea. Do you know why President Bush writes to Kim Jong-il and calls him Mr. Chairman, not Mr. President? Do you know why? Because he's only the chairman of the Communist Party and actually the head of the armed forces. He's not the president of the country. The president of the country is his father, who's been dead for 15 years. So North Korea is a necrocracy. or a thanatocracy, or a mausolocracy. I've tried all these in my time. And the Son is the reincarnation of that Father by official doctrine. And I'm sure I know, believe me, that I'm not speaking in a Christian church, but just to whisper, that's only one short of a trinity that they've got there. And it's worship all the day and all the time. But there is one difference. You can get out of it in North Korea. You can defect. You can die. You can damn well die and then you're rid of it. With monotheism and theocracy, you can't, because it will pursue you after you're dead. This is totalitarianism. By definition, it is the most frigid, rigid, unalterable dictatorship. There's no appeal from it. It knows your thoughts. It can convict you of thought crime. It is much, much worse than Big Brother. It's much more sadistic. It's much more totalitarian. And there is so much reason to be grateful that there's absolutely no evidence that any rabbi or priest or mullah has ever produced that would make you believe there was a single word of truth in it. So at least we have that much to celebrate. Thank you.
That was your brief rebuttal, huh? At least now we know what a brief rebuttal looks like.
Okay. I asked for that.
Listen.
I asked for it.
Yes. So let me start with North Korea. Let me start where you ended, and then I'll work my way back, which is, you know, it's a strange kind of dialectic when religious regimes are blamed for being religious and atheistic regimes are blamed for being religious. There seems to be no escape. Basically, if a country does something bad, it must be religious. But in fact, North Korea is the antithesis of what the monotheistic faiths say, which is you don't worship a human being. And you have gone on again and again about hubris. It seems to me that hubris is assuming that human beings are the best thing going. That's what you have to believe in a world without God. That we may be imperfect, but we are the best things going. I don't think we're the best things going. And I think the idea that we are is a frightening idea, not a reassuring idea. And as to the question with which Mr. Hitchens began, which is, if God is a loving God, then why do we have anything worse than scraping our knee? I have never done this in answer to the question of evil, but now I'm going to quote Mr. Hitchens. Because if you recall, in his initial talk, he said, I don't think a perfect world is a good world. I think a world of affliction and challenge and difficulty is a world of growth. That's exactly right. If you had a world, think for a moment, when people say, why do bad things happen to good people? Assume for a moment you had a world in which good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Okay? You steal, you get a disease. Every time. Right? As night follows day. Would anyone steal? No. But their not stealing would have no moral content. They don't steal out of prudence, out of caution, not out of goodness, not out of growth. When we train children, to recur to the theme of children and childishness, at first we give them rewards. We say, you do this, I'll give you a reward. But the time comes when you want them to do it for its own sake. And everybody knows, every human being knows, that you can be the best person who ever lived and still lead a terrible life. But that your goodness is goodness. Not calculation, not prudence, not the idea that God promises you, if you just propitiate God enough, that you'll get saved. And let me just close, although I did, by the way, I don't make any claims to prophecy, but I told you that you would hear a litany of bad things that religions do, which they do. Although I must say that I still think that if you tote up the scoreboard, Mr. Hitchens talked about slavery, for example, and he said, you know, in no place does slavery exist without reference to the holy books. I think he's forgetting Rome, Greece, Assyria, Babylonia. It was actually civilizations that had holy books that abolished slavery, not that created slavery. And those who abolished it, like Wilberforce and Brown and so on, were evangelists and used the Bible to abolish it. But let's put that aside.
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's do that.
The justification for slavery is biblical.
No, I didn't. You can't. You're not allowed to interrupt.
Okay. Don't ask rhetorical questions, then.
No, what? You asked rhetorical questions. I can ask rhetorical.
You didn't take me up on them. You should have
But
done.
remember,
I wouldn't complain.
now don't try to convince them that good manners are a
Don't whine.
religious virtue. I
Don't
don't
whine,
think that
don't
that's.
No whining. No whining.
I want to close with this, and I know that this may be unfairly personal, but in part we're talking about our two books, and because this is part of what the book is about, I'm going to go there. It's not about getting goods from God. That's not what religion is. Part of the book talks about my own experience with my wife's having cancer, mine having a brain tumor, and my having gone through chemotherapy a couple of years ago for lymphoma. And as I was going through chemotherapy, I was very well aware that asking God to heal me wasn't going to mean that I was healed. That God doesn't work that way. That God wouldn't say, Wolpe in bed 2 prayed. So him I'm going to heal. Bed 3, I haven't heard word 1. Bed 3 can go. And I didn't feel betrayed when I found out that I was in remission but not cured. And that I may never be. Because what I prayed for wasn't a doctor in the sky. What I prayed for was closeness. What I prayed for was the certainty that I was not alone. What I prayed for was blessing and love, not magic. Durkheim, the great sociologist, pointed out a long time ago that there are not churches of magic, there are churches of religion, because it's social, it's congregational, it's what we do together as well as what we do with God. Don't think for a minute that because some people misuse that force isn't real, and that God can't touch human life. And it is true that God can be pushed away, but after all, as the Kotzker Rebbe said a couple hundred years ago to his students, where does God dwell? And they said, that's easy, God dwells everywhere. And he said, no, God dwells wherever we let God in. Rhetoric.
Small.
What do you want?
Yeah. Okay. We are, I guess, resuming what you call the oldest argument in human history.
Yes.
Right? And we're certainly there. One question that comes to mind after hearing both of you, and I'd ask you both to respond, maybe we'll start with you, David, is in doing your research and engaging in other discussions, other debates about God, and from tonight as well, what's the most compelling case that the other side has made?
You want me to give away the game? Are you going to ask him the same? Okay, yes. Fair enough.
All right. What gives you pause?
You want to know really what gives me most pause, honestly? I'll tell you what is hard for me. For me, the greatest difficulty sometimes, in some ways, that which I find most compelling also gives me the hardest time. What I find most compelling in some ways is human beings. When I look at another human being, I don't believe that they're accidents of ancient chemicals. I don't believe they're just sophisticated animals. I believe that I see before me a spirit, an embodied spirit, but a spirit nonetheless, and I feel sometimes what the Protestant theologian Teilhard de Chardin said, which is that we are not material beings having a spiritual experience, but spiritual beings having a physical experience. That's the good side. The hard part for me came, and I remember when I first realized it, was when my mother had an aneurysm. And because she had an aneurysm and her brain was flooded with blood when she was 52 years old, she became aphasic. That is, she can't speak. She has difficulty reading. Her thoughts often get confused. And I thought, if in fact we are spirit, then how can it be that a change to our physiology changes our personality so powerfully and so dramatically? And I have answers that sometimes satisfy me, but for me,
that is the most difficult challenge personally to religion. And the only thing that I will end with is to say that for me, challenges and questions are not necessarily antagonistic to a religious spirit. That it seems to me that challenges and questions can bring you deeper into faith, and that I'm comfortable being what Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav said about himself. He said, "I am a moon man. My faith waxes and wanes."
So I'd pose the same question to you, Christopher. Right?
Yes, and just for a second to comment on what you said, if I have a great difficulty with most people I meet believing that they're even intelligent primates. And
you do seem intent on
and I
making the
think
manners
that, however, if you think that if you make the assumption, which I do, not that we have bodies, but that we are bodies, then there isn't any mystery that remains to be explained about why a bleed in your brain will make you behave as if you weren't human anymore and can't speak or can't think. The explanation is quite ready to hand. And if you presume that we are here not because of a divine design, nor are we here under a divine supervision, but we are here because of the combination of random mutation and natural selection and evolution, again, there's no mystery. There's nothing ridiculous that you have to impose on yourself. There's no violation of Occam's rule of don't introduce absurd assumptions that's required. On the other hand, if you think, how long do you think we've been on the Earth as a species? Francis Collins of the Human Genome Project says 100,000 years. Richard Dawkins thinks it could be as long as 250,000. I'll take 100,000. For those years, 100,000, just score 100,000 years. Those years, the human species is born. Most of its children die in the process of being born. Life expectancy is perhaps 25, and pretty miserable. You'll die mainly of your teeth, and very unpleasantly. There'll be turf wars over women, animals, land, panic. When the sky darkens for an eclipse, there'll be madness and rage and fear. When there's a tsunami, no one will know. There's no germ theory of disease. Unbelievable horror. But it goes on, and millimetrically things improve. And for the first 96,000 years of this, the heavens watch indifferently. And then about the largest monotheistic claim is 6,000 to 4,000 years ago. They say, actually, it's time to intervene. Maybe in some really illiterate part of the Middle East. If you can believe that, you can believe absolutely anything. But you would have then to believe that this supervising deity was either very cruel and very capricious, and or, because it's not exclusive, very incompetent.
And this to you is the best argument for faith?
Yes. So, now, as to why I've ever questioned my own atheism, all of my colleagues agree, we've all discussed this a lot of times. The most intriguing argument against our position is what's called the fine-tuning argument. That if a few details of science and physics and biology and chemistry were little different, only fractionally different, there would be nothing instead of something. It's true. I mean, it's a very intriguing thought. The fact that there is nothing, that there's something, not nothing, doesn't prove a designer, certainly doesn't prove a deity, it certainly doesn't prove a deity who cares about you or intervenes in your life or who supervises you waking and sleeping, but nonetheless, it's a thought that has to be confronted. I'll just close by saying what I've contributed, I think myself, to this argument, which is the following. As we now know, because of Edwin Hubble and many others, the universe is expanding very, very fast, has been ever since the original Big Bang, and the rate of expansion, which not even Hubble quite predicted, Lawrence Krauss worked this out a few years ago, is not slowing down, as Newtonians might have thought, it's increasing. The rate of the expansion is increasing, the redshift light. So very, very soon there won't even be any evidence in the cosmos that there ever was a Big Bang. Things will be flown so far apart. And in the meantime, and you can see it in the night sky, the Andromeda galaxy is headed directly towards ours, as it has been doing since long before we could think about such things. So very soon, what something we have will be replaced by a whole lot of nothing. So who designed that? What divine father arranged that for us? what caring person who watches over bedsides and gives people hope designed things that way? I ask you, there's only one way to grow up, and it is to stop believing that there is either a tyrannical or a benign parent who's looking out for you. In my opinion, that tyranny would be much worse if it was benign, but you have your choice. No, thank you for asking. I know I have a tendency to talk too much, don't I? Do you wish I'd talk less? Never mind. No, never mind. Look, I think it's very important to distinguish the numinous from the supernatural or the superstitious. The numinous, or you might want to say the transcendent. For example, I'll make it quick. I wrote a book about the Parthenon, a building I can't tire of. There are so many ways of looking at it, from the outside, from the inside, its measurements, its symmetries, the stories told by its mutilated sculpture, the interiority and the exteriority of it, its positioning in the ancient world. Really, a good person interested in aesthetics could give a life to the study of the thing. But I have no conviction at all about the cult of Pallas Athena, which inspired its being built. I don't think the cult of Pallas Athena was a valid religion. I don't think it. I think it was a man-made cult. I have no belief that the Eleusinian mysteries held any real mystery. I think it was a piece of priestcraft. I'm sorry to say that it looks very likely as if two of the stories on the frieze actually are about a human sacrifice to propitiate a bad god. And I think Athenian imperialism in respect of not just Sparta, but the Delian and Melian islands was a terrible tyranny. Nonetheless, could not be without that temple. So one of the great cultural and aesthetic tasks, I think, is separating the numinous, the transcendent, the beautiful, and the aesthetic from the superstitious and from the supernatural, which is a dimension that doesn't exist and that we don't need and that can't help us.